Hi, this is Matt Baker. Last year on this channel, I did a series of videos on the greatest dynasties of all time. There was a video on the greatest European dynasties, one on the greatest Asian dynasties, and one on the greatest African dynasties. However, in each case, I limited my choices to the medieval and modern periods. This left several great dynasties unmentioned and unranked. Well, today I'm going to fix that, because in this video, I'm going to rank the greatest ancient dynasties of all time. And to do this, I'm going to be helped by several other channels. I started by asking 10 history YouTubers to each nominate an ancient dynasty that they thought should be included in the top 10. What I'm going to do now is play a clip by each channel and then rank their choices according to where I think each one should be placed. Throughout, I'll mostly be using my Ancient History Family Trees chart, which is available as a poster from my website, usefulcharts.com. Please keep in mind that the list in this video is going to be quite subjective, but hopefully the process will be fun and educational. So let's get to it. The first nomination comes from the channel History with Cy.
King of Kings, King of Anshan, King of Sumer and Akkad, King of the Four Quarters, not to mention being called a Messiah in the Hebrew Bible. These are just some of the titles that were given to the founder of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, Cyrus II, better known to us as Cyrus the Great. Believed to have been the fourth king of the Achaemenid dynasty, Cyrus founded an empire that during his day stretched from the Aegean Sea to the mountains and steppes of Afghanistan and Central Asia. His successors expanded the Achaemenid realm far into Egypt and southeastern Europe, making it the first world empire to encompass parts of 3 continents. However, it's not just the size of the empire that it once held, or the number of people that lived within its borders that made the Achaemenid dynasty great, but the way in which it ruled over all of that territory and the diverse populations within it. The Achaemenids were especially known for their tolerance towards the customs and religious practices of their non-Persian subject peoples. This was actually quite rare in the history of the ancient world, where, with a few exceptions, the temples and religious sanctuaries of conquered peoples were looted and often destroyed as punishment by the conquerors. The Achaemenids not only allowed all of those under their banner to worship as they chose, but in many cases even supported them in the construction of their holy sanctuaries, as was the case with the reconstruction of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem and many other shrines and sanctuaries throughout the Near East. Even the ancient Greeks, who considered the Persians to have been amongst their greatest enemies, admired many aspects of Persian culture, and especially the way in which the Achaemenids administrated their empire. The Achaemenid model of governing worked and was copied by all of the great states that came after it until at least medieval times. It's for these and other reasons that the Achaemenid dynasty may have been the greatest in all of antiquity.
Okay, so Cy chose the Achaemenid dynasty, a very good choice indeed. They ruled ancient Persia from 550 to 330 BCE. And are shown in pink here on my Ancient History Family Trees chart. Like Cy said, they built the first truly world empire, being the first empire that would fit the definition of what we tend to think of as being an empire, i.e. a collection of many diverse states ruled by a single government. And the administrative structures that they developed to do this became the model for pretty much every other empire that came after it. So, because of their lasting influence and because of the sheer size of their empire, at its height, their empire comprised over 44% of the world's population, I think they deserve not only to be in the top 10, but in the top 5. So, I'm going to place them here at number 4. The next clip is from Hikma History.
Hello people, Hikma History here. My nomination for the greatest ancient dynasty is the underrated but pivotal Carthaginian Empire. Often viewed in light of their epic yet failing effort against Rome, we should remember that the contest between the two was a tightly contested affair. The larger-than-life Carthaginian general Hannibal's invasion of Italy very nearly inflicted a fatal defeat on the Romans before they reached their own grand heights. In the end, as the old saying goes, history belongs to the victors, and the Roman-Punic Wars ended in the destruction of Carthage as a city and state. But the Carthaginian claim to fame does not solely revolve around a losing effort to the Romans. For about 300 years up to the 3rd century BC, Carthage had a domineering presence across the Western Mediterranean. It made use of its powerful navy to maintain its control of vital naval trade routes. It had its roots in the ancient Phoenicians of the Levant, and like its predecessors, Carthage was a maritime power with a huge interest in maintaining important mercantile networks.
So Hikma History chose the Carthaginians. But remember, we're not talking about the greatest ancient civilizations in this video. We're talking about the greatest dynasties. And a dynasty is defined as being a series of successive leaders, usually linked by genealogy. So in the case of the Carthaginians, I think who Hikma was referring to was the Barcid dynasty. The Barcids are indeed an interesting choice because they were not emperors or even kings. They were generals. That's because Carthage was a republic, not a monarchy. The Barcids are shown on this chart in gold. But even though they were not monarchs, the Barcids had a tremendous impact on Carthage over several generations. Their most famous member, Hannibal, being considered to this day one of the greatest generals the world has ever seen. He's the guy famous for marching elephants over the Alps. But like Hikma said, the Carthaginians are often forgotten because of their eventual defeat by Rome. I'm going to place them at number 10. This is not because I think they weren't great. It's simply because we've only got 10 slots available. Keep in mind, any dynasty that ends up on this list is beating out dozens of others who came close to deserving a place as well. The next clip is from the channel Dig It with Raven.
Hey friends, Raven here from Dig It with Raven. Everyone talks about the 18th dynasty when we talk about ancient Egyptian great dynasties, and rightly so. We've got Hatshepsut, we've got Tutmosis III, we've got King Tut, for goodness sakes. But I don't think there's enough love given to a lot of the later dynasties when we're talking about ancient Egypt, and especially the 25th in particular. So let's talk about why it's one of my favorite dynasties and one of the best ones in my opinion. The 25th dynasty is also known as the Nubian dynasty or the Kushite Empire, and given all these extra names, you probably figured out where the pharaohs of this dynasty came from: Nubia. The dynasty was the last in the 3rd intermediate period. And intermediate periods are usually defined as periods of decline and political instability, and they usually have some conquest and rule over Egypt from foreign states or neighboring areas. Which brings me to the Nubian pharaohs. The Nubian king P conquered Egypt all the way up to the Nile Delta, and this reunification and further conquests throughout the dynasty created the largest empire that Egypt has seen since the New Kingdom. Not only did they reunify Egypt and revive the powerhouse of the Nile, they also changed the art and architecture scene dramatically. Even though they were foreign rulers, they really did revive and reaffirm a lot of ancient Egyptian religious traditions, temples, and art, all while adding their own little Nubian flair. Best of all, in the 25th dynasty, we see the first widespread construction of pyramids since the Middle Kingdom, which is like 1,000 years before, so that's really crazy. Yes, the Nubians loved the tall and pointy things just as much as we do. In fact, they liked building pyramids so much that there are twice as many Nubian pyramids standing today as there are Egyptian ones. Nubia is often an afterthought when people think of ancient Egyptian or African archaeology and history, but they have such an amazing story and they deserve so much more love in my opinion. They revitalized and reunified Egypt, brought an end to the 3rd intermediate period, and consequently ushered in a new period of Egyptian prosperity. So there you have it friends, that's my opinion on one of the best dynasties in ancient history. Coming at you from Cleopatra's Needle in London. Stay dirty my friends.
Okay, so Raven chose the 25th dynasty of Egypt, also known as the Kushite or Nubian dynasty. They are shown on the chart in green. Now, the thing about this dynasty is that they were actually in power for many years before the period that Egyptologists call the 25th dynasty, as well as for many years after. It's just that before and after, they didn't control Egypt, but they did control Kush, aka Nubia. That's where they built all those pyramids that Raven showed, and where they had a technologically advanced culture that lasted for hundreds of years. As you probably know, African history is an understudied subject in comparison to other aspects of history. Even though we have a lot of inscriptions in Meroitic, the language and writing system spoken in Nubia, we can't really translate it. Therefore, there is a lot about the history of the Nubian dynasty that is still waiting to be discovered. That said, based on the archaeology alone, I'm going to place them at number 7. Next up is a clip from the channel Civil War Week by Week.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Teagan from the Civil War Week by Week channel, and the Han Chinese dynasty is one of the greatest dynasties of all time and the greatest one in the ancient world. They didn't have the same flashiness that the Roman Empire had, but they do have one thing: continued prosperity. While it is not as much fun to discuss the intricacies of economics as battles, it is by far way more important. The Han Chinese entire economy is very similar to our own. A money-based system, their coinage in the end was used all the way up to the Tang Dynasty, and it prospered under state monopolies that would later become privatized, nationalized as it goes. The greatest advancement for the Han Dynasty was the Silk Road. That brought prosperity to many places, creating a more interconnected world. This globalization of the world allowed for the modern world to prosper isn't thanks to the great battles that the Han Chinese won, though they did win many great ones. It was due to the emperors, and the empire as a whole, looking to the future not as one of conquest, but of collaboration. One where prosperity would be made not by the sword, but by the plow.
All right, so we now have the Han Dynasty, without a doubt the greatest dynasty from ancient China. It is shown on the chart in red. Now, the neat thing about China is that it pretty much evolved independently from the rest of the ancient world. In contrast, Southern Europe, Northern Africa, the Middle East, and to some extent India were all connected throughout most of ancient history, and therefore ideas and inventions flowed freely between the civilizations there, along with more tangible trade goods. China didn't have this advantage, so everything it developed, it pretty much developed on its own. And like Jonathan mentioned, it was way ahead of its time when it comes to things like economics. So, being that the Han Dynasty represents the pinnacle of ancient Chinese civilization, I think it definitely deserves a relatively high placement on this list. I'm going to put it at number 5. Now, before we move on, I should point out that there is another part of the globe that developed urban civilizations in ancient times, totally independent from the rest of the world. That would be, of course, the Americas. However, please note that my top 10 list is not going to include any dynasties from this region. This is not because that region didn't develop any major civilizations. It obviously did, whether we're talking about the Olmecs or Mayans in Mesoamerica, or the Poverty Point culture in North America. But with the exception of the Mayans, those civilizations either left no writing or left writing that is yet to be deciphered. On top of this, the societies that we do know about, like the Mayans, appear to have been structured quite a bit differently than those in, say, the Fertile Crescent or China. For example, there was no Mayan empire per se. Various noble dynasties seem to have dominated individual city-states, but it would appear that no one dynasty ever came to rule the entire civilization. Okay, with that said, let's view our next clip, which is from the channel Digital Hammurabi.
Hi, we're Dr. Josh and Megan from the Digital Hammurabi YouTube channel. Given that we're both Assyriologists, it's probably no surprise that we're nominating a Mesopotamian dynasty for the title of Greatest Ancient Dynasty of All Time. We think that the first dynasty of Akkad, or the Old Akkadian Empire, should definitely win this one. After all, they built the world's first dynastic empire.
The dynasty was started in the mid-3rd millennium by a guy named Sargon of Akkad. Later texts make him into the Mesopotamian version of Moses, born to a priestess who set him floating down a river in a reed basket. Of course, it's unlikely that any of this information is historically reliable. His name in Akkadian, Sharukin, means the king is legitimate, which tells us that regardless of his legendary origins, he was almost certainly not born into a royal family.
Whatever we can say about the founding of the Old Akkadian Empire under Sargon of Akkad, the creation of an empire was significant development in the late 3rd millennium, and in the region altogether. Extending his political reach through force, Sargon was able to unite northern and southern Mesopotamia for the first time in history. Part of his strategy to control the south was to install his daughter, Enheduanna, as high priestess to the moon god at a temple in southern Sumer, making his control of the region truly a family affair. As an aside, Enheduanna is also the world's first named poet.
Sargon's 2 sons followed him to the throne, Remush and Manashtushu, but his grandson, Naram-Sin, is truly the headline grabber of the dynasty. At some point during his reign, at least 2, possibly 3 coalitions came against Naram-Sin and his city, Akkad. Naram-Sin defeated the rebellious cities, and his grateful citizens petitioned the gods to grant him divinity. This is the first instance of royal divinization in the Mesopotamian record.
So there you have it. The world's first dynastic empire, the world's first named author, and Mesopotamia's first divine king.
So, as you might have guessed, Digital Hammurabi chose a Mesopotamian dynasty, the first dynasty of Akkad. This dynasty is notable in that historians usually credit it with creating the world's first empire. Note that I'm not showing my ancient history family trees chart for this one. That's because that chart starts around 1500 BCE. The first dynasty of Akkad ruled a whopping 800 years before that. Instead, I'm showing you my timeline of world history chart. This section is from the early Bronze Age, which is when writing first appeared, and therefore when, generally speaking, we move from prehistory to history. Mesopotamia was the location of one of the 3 major civilizations to develop during this period, the other 2 being Egypt and the Indus Valley. Prior to the rise of Akkad, Mesopotamia was dominated by Sumerian city-states, famous for being the first to use a bunch of things, such as the wheel, the plow, and the sail. Akkad kind of represents the pinnacle of this early stage of human development. Although they were originally outsiders, they were the ones who united the Sumerians for the first time. For this amazing accomplishment, they definitely deserve a spot on the top 10. I'm going to place them at number 9. Okay, next up is KhAnubis. Based on that hat he always wears, I have a feeling I know who he's going to choose.
Okay, but have you considered the 4th dynasty of ancient Egypt? I mean, name a famous structure from ancient Egypt. The Giza pyramids, the Saqqara step pyramid, the Sphinx. These were all built during the 4th dynasty. This dynasty was literally so great, they went on to inspire dynasties thousands of years in the future. I mean, tell me that isn't a legacy worth remembering.
Yep, KhAnubis chose an Egyptian dynasty, in particular the 4th dynasty, builders of the Great Pyramids. They, like the Akkadians, ruled during the early Bronze Age. They too, because of their great antiquity, don't show up on my ancient history family trees chart, but they are included here on my ancient Egypt poster. In my opinion, I think they deserve to rank slightly higher than Akkad, simply because they built the largest, most amazing structures in the entire ancient world, ones that still stand to this day and continue to feed the human imagination. But all things considered, I don't think they deserve to rank higher than some of the later Egyptian dynasties, such as the 25th. So I'm going to squeeze them in here at number 8. Okay, next up is my good friend Siawish from Al-Muqaddimah.
Okay, so why are the Mauryas the greatest ancient dynasty of all time? It's not because of Ashok Maurya, even though he is literally a symbol of India. I mean, the wheel on the Indian flag is called the Ashok Chakra because it appears on his edicts and it's largely associated with him. But it's actually a variation of the Dharma Chakra. I'm getting off the point. My point is that it's because of Chandragupta Maurya, Ashok's grandfather, that I consider this dynasty to have been the greatest dynasty of the ancient times. Chandragupta probably studied at the prestigious Takshila University, and he might have even met Alexander. His origins, while certainly humble, are kinda unknown, but what we do know about him is that he defeated the mighty Nanda Empire that had oppressed his people, and he established the first Indian empire to rule a vast majority of India. Basically, you can say that it was the first Indian empire. To recap, he rose from humble beginnings, destroyed his oppressors, established an empire, united most of India under him, and then abdicated his throne in favor of his son and became a Jain monk. He went into the mountains and starved himself to death in search of purity and peace. How incredibly amazing is his story. The Mauryas brought major changes and development to India. Ashok, for example, converted to Buddhism and helped spread it all over India and to Sri Lanka. They also established a law code and helped develop Sanskrit further than it was at that point. Since their decline, many empires have tried to emulate them, or at least their legend, in order to gain legitimacy. When the newly founded country of India needed a foundational mythology, it looked to them. The impact that their reality and their legend has had on India is immeasurable and, in my opinion, still ongoing. What the Roman Empire did for Europe, the Mauryas certainly did for India.
Surprise, surprise! Siawish, being from Pakistan, nominated a South Asian dynasty, the Mauryan dynasty, arguably the greatest ancient dynasty from this region. They are shown on the Ancient History Family Trees chart in orange. Not only did they unite the subcontinent for the first time, they also developed the Brahmi script, which is the basis for every writing system in South Asia today, as well as many parts of Southeast Asia. It's hard to tell if Buddhism or even Hinduism would have developed the way they did if it had not been for the unification and centralization that the Mauryans accomplished during their rule. However, I don't think that the Mauryans are quite as consequential for India as the Han were for China. So I'm going to place them just below the Han dynasty, here at number 6. We're now left with the top 3 spots. I've reserved these spots for the 3 dynasties who helped build the 3 pillars of Western civilization. But all 3 contributed not only to Western civilization, but to the global civilization that we all live in today. I admit, these choices are probably quite biased on my part, but I did say up front, this list is highly subjective. I'm now going to go in order of my choices from 3 to 1, which means that the next clip is the one from Philip at Let's Talk Religion. He chose a dynasty with a name that you might not be familiar with, but who wrote a book that you probably are familiar with.
So look, the Saddukite dynasty of priests played a major role in a decisive moment in religious history. As many of you might know, the Torah, or 5 books of Moses, which serves as probably the most central text in all of Judaism, as well as a very important text for Christianity as well, is considered by scholars today to have been written by multiple authors across a wide span of time and cultural influence. And according to many sources and theories, the Saddukites, or Israelite priests of the Babylonian and post-Babylonian/Persian period, were responsible for putting together the Torah or Bible into its final form that it has today. A project that probably did take place in the, as I mentioned, the post-Babylonian or Persian period. The Israelites at this time were part of a network of neighboring cultures and religions which all influenced each other, and the stories that were included in the Bible by the priest at this time included not only the earliest stories by the Israelites themselves, but also stories and influences from neighboring cultures like Mesopotamia, Egypt, and indeed Persia. And all these influences then seem to have helped shape the Bible and thus also Second Temple Judaism, the form of the religion that not only led to the religion of Judaism as we know it today, but which also served as the basis from which Christianity developed and also became a very important factor in the later development of Islam. In other words, the Zadokites, in their possible project of putting together the final form of the Torah or the Bible, is a decisive factor in the history of the Abrahamic religions and also some of the most major events in world history.
The interesting thing about the top 3 dynasties on this list is that none of them are traditional dynasties. In this case, we have a dynasty of religious leaders rather than political leaders, the Zadokites, also known as the Cohens or Kohanim. They are shown here in blue on this chart by Sam Aronow, which is still in development but will hopefully be available as a poster sometime in the future. For those of you who are regular viewers of Useful Charts, you'll know that I'm currently in the middle of a series on who wrote the Bible. In that series, I've made it clear that the authors of the Bible relied heavily on the myths and legends of neighboring cultures, primarily those of Egypt and Mesopotamia. But the neat thing about the Bible is that the authors brought together many different literary traditions, combined them with their own unique beliefs, and ended up creating a synthesis of ancient ideas that, to this day, are read widely. This is mostly due to the work of the ancient Israelite priests, who put together the final version of the Torah and the rest of the Hebrew Bible during the Persian and Greek periods. If you knew that there was only going to be one Jewish dynasty on this list, you might have assumed that it would have been the Davidic dynasty. But I think the Zadokite dynasty had way more influence on world history. In putting together the Hebrew Bible, they laid the foundation not only for Judaism, but also for Christianity and Islam. Thus, one could argue that they are at least partially responsible for the beliefs of 4.4 billion people on the planet today. If that doesn't merit a placement in the top 3, I don't know what does. Next up is Cypher from the channel The Cynical Historian.
Hey, Cypher here, and I'm the Cynical Historian. I'd say the best ancient dynasty wasn't one of power, but one of influence that far exceeded that of any empire. Some bald guy in Athens, asking a bunch of annoying questions, began the most important intellectual tradition of the ancient world, to the point that one philosopher said that all Western philosophy since then is merely footnotes on one of his pupils. That gadfly was Socrates, of course. Plato was his most famous follower, and Aristotle followed him in turn, who even went on to instruct Alexander the Great himself. But I am here to tell you they are usurpers to Socrates' legacy. Nay, the true line lies with Antisthenes. He kept Socrates' wily spirit alive, directly inspiring and teaching the most punk philosopher of all time, Diogenes, the Cynic. Unlike Aristotle, Alexander offered Diogenes the world, and he refused, simply asking for the person who was going to conquer much of the world to simply move aside and give him back the sunlight he'd been enjoying prior. When Plato defined humans as a bipedal, featherless animal, Diogenes plucked a chicken and threw it in front of Plato's class, exclaiming, "Here is Plato's human being." Cynics carried Socrates' spirit, not Plato's school. Even Nietzsche said, "Perhaps no philosopher is closer to the truth than the cynic, for happiness of the animal, who is after all the consummate cynic, provides living proof of the truth of cynicism." Nietzsche's story of the madman in the marketplace who proclaims, "God is dead and we have killed him," is directly referencing Diogenes, who would similarly go into the market with a lantern searching for a true human being, since he was obviously discontent with Plato's version of that. I have an entire video on cynicism over on my channel, but that punk spirit has inspired numerous movements ever since, from Christian monasticism to American transcendentalism. After all, transcendentalism gave us nonviolent resistance, aka civil disobedience, which is what drove people like Gandhi and Martin Luther King, so you could say cynicism has a lot of effects. Diogenes himself directly taught Crates and Hipparchia as cynics. Crates in turn taught Zeno, who founded Stoicism, which was perhaps the most influential philosophy of the Roman Empire, with leading lights such as Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius. Not to be outdone by this dynastic offshoot, Julian is called an apostate by Christians because he claimed affinity for cynicism and the old gods instead. The Cynics remained practicing until well into the 5th century AD, with Celestius of Emesa being the last one known. But who knows? Maybe some cynical historians might rise up in their stead.
Again, here we have a very non-traditional dynasty. So non-traditional that it doesn't show up on any of my family tree charts. But I would argue that it definitely deserves to be called a dynasty. It's simply a teacher-student dynasty rather than a parent-child dynasty. The main members of this quote-unquote family include Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and even Alexander the Great. But as Cypher pointed out, it also includes many other big names as well. Philosophers such as Antisthenes and Diogenes, the founders of Cynicism. It is impossible to overstate the importance of the classical Greek philosophers in terms of their influence on the world we live in today. The Zadokites may have provided us with the bulk of the religious stories that are still floating around, but it was the intellectual descendants of Socrates that provided us with the foundations upon which modern philosophy as well as modern science were built. I therefore chose the Socratic dynasty for the number 2 position. That leaves us with only one remaining dynasty. To introduce that dynasty, let's play the final clip from the channel History and Headlines.
Hello, I'm Dr. Czar from History and Headlines. My nomination for the greatest ancient dynasty of all time has to be the 5 good emperors of Rome, specifically Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. Ruling from 96 AD through 180 AD, their succession was of the adoptive variety, whereby each emperor would choose his heir by merit rather than by birth, and symbolically adopt that heir. Niccolò Machiavelli said of the adoptive heir idea, quote, "From the study of this history, we may also learn how a good government is to be established. For while all the emperors who succeeded to the throne by birth, except Titus, were bad, all were good who succeeded by adoption, as in the case of the 5 from Nerva to Marcus." End quote. In our assessment of the 5 good emperors as the greatest of the ancient dynasties, we are joined by the esteemed author and historian Edward Gibbon, who argued, quote, "If a man were called to fix the period in the history of the world during which the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous, he would without hesitation name that which elapsed from the death of Domitian to the accession of KhAnubis."
So you might have guessed this going in, but it is a Roman dynasty that takes the top spot. In particular, the Nerva-Antonine dynasty, which primarily consists of the 5 emperors who reigned when the Roman Empire was at its height. They are shown here on my Roman Emperors family tree chart in green. As Dr. Czar mentioned, what made this dynasty so great was that it relied on a unique method of succession, one whereby the emperor adopted the individual who he felt would make the best ruler, rather than simply appointing his eldest son. In many ways, Western civilization today, as well as much of global civilization, can be seen as the direct descendant of the Roman Empire. Not only does much of the world now use the Roman alphabet, most legal codes used around the world today also have their roots in Roman law. From medical terms to the architecture used for government buildings to the power of the Roman Catholic Church, the influence of Rome can be seen everywhere on the planet. So that was my ranking of the top 10 ancient dynasties of all time. Special thanks to all of the YouTubers who helped put this together. You can find a link to all of the channels who participated in the description. And let us know what you think of our choices. Who did we miss? And who would you have put at number 1? Let us know in the comments. Thanks for watching.